In terms of mother-child relationships, what we had were two things. When the children were in 5th grade, they filled out a self-report measure of attachment. So this is the child's sort of conscious perceptions of how they view their relationship with their parent that measures a dimension of security. So unfortunately, I'm not going to tell you anything about particular patterns of insecure attachment here. The middle child assessment is only along the security dimension. And there have been many assessments of parental sensitivity. It's one of the main constructs in the NICHD early child care study. And so we took assessments of maternal sensitivity that were made when children were in grades 1, 3, and 5 and averaged them. So we have sort of a history of maternal sensitivity variable. Maternal anxiety was assessed at 3 times, and so we aggregated those to get kind of a more of a trait measure of anxiety. And negative life events had been assessed twice. We aggregated that, so it's again sort of a history of negative life events. And mothers, what we used were their ratings of the impact of these events. And finally, in terms of potential child characteristics, so unfortunately, the child temperament assessments are somewhat limited in the NICHD data set. So what we use, there's really not a good temperament measure exactly within the middle childhood years. So we have data that was collected at 54 months from mother's maternal report of sort of behavioral inhibition, shyness, using the Rothbard scales. And early pubertal development, which was nurses' ratings using Tanner stages of pubertal development. And we particularly looked at 4th and 5th grade with the idea that early pubertal development would be the risk. And then child sex. I can tell you that pubertal development didn't predict anything, didn't predict anxiety, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. And interestingly, there were no gender differences, nor did gender interact with anything I'm going to tell you today. So just to get that out of the way, we won't talk about that further. So the analysis plan is really 2 regressions that I'm going to talk about today. One of them is to take all of these variables that I discuss, parent-child relationships, the maternal family, and the child characteristics, and ask how do these variables predict to anxiety at 5th and 6th grade? Can we predict who's going to be anxious later? And then do these same set of variables predict who's likely to become more anxious across middle childhood? And so I'm tabling only those variables that were significant in the regression in terms of unique prediction, but it also turns out they're also the only variables that had significant zero-order correlations with later anxiety. Okay, so basically, who's likely to be anxious at 5th and 6th grade? Children who are less secure, who have mothers who are more anxious, who experience more negative life events, and who are higher on behavioral inhibition are more likely later to be rated by mothers as demonstrating higher levels of anxiety. And so again, I put the betas up there just to show you that each one of these, again, is adding to prediction uniquely, is making a contribution here. Now, before I tell you about predicting change in anxiety, you probably want to know how stable it is. How much was there change going on? So I can just tell you that if you look at the kindergarten 1st grade anxiety measure and correlate with the 5th and 6th grade, it's fairly stable. You know, when you consider this is across 5 years of time, you get a 0.5 correlation. And to put that in context, if you go back to the previous slide, you see all these correlations predicting from other things, right, to anxiety are between 0.09 and 0.32. And so, you know, if you want to know who's going to be anxious in 5th and 6th grade, your best predictor, not surprisingly, is who was anxious earlier in childhood, sort of kind of almost a developmental law, right? Best predictor of something is the earlier measure of itself. But with a 0.5 correlation, there has obviously got to be some change going on, too. This is not approaching unity yet. And so still leaves the interesting question of whether we can predict changes in anxiety across middle childhood. And so this is just the results of when you have, from the second step where you've got both anxiety, you've got earlier anxiety as a predictor, plus all of these others, showing you how these variables predict changes in anxiety. And the interesting thing is that it's a lot of the same variables that predict later anxiety also predict increases in anxiety. So to start with the things that are consistent with the earlier findings, children children who are less secure, children who have mothers who are more anxious, and those who experience more negative life events during middle childhood are those who are more likely to show this increase in anxiety across middle childhood. Behavioral inhibition doesn't predict change in anxiety. Remember, it predicts later levels, but it doesn't predict change. And one other thing I'll point out here is maternal sensitivity has this curious relationship to changes in anxiety. If you looked simply at the zero-order correlation, it's not significant, and it goes sort of the way in the direction you would expect. It's not significant, but it goes in the direction you might have thought: higher maternal sensitivity, lower anxiety. Curious thing here is that maternal sensitivity is predicting increases in anxiety. But you have to recall that's maternal sensitivity after controlling for these other things. So it's that aspect of sensitivity, for example, that doesn't co-vary with secure attachment. So I'm not sure what exactly, we haven't had a chance to fully explore yet, well, what exactly could that mean? Is that somehow being overly solicitous, for example, once you partial out maybe some more appropriate level of sensitivity? So I'm not sure, but that is a curious finding here. That's not a typo, in case you were wondering. Okay, so just to summarize what I've just told you about here, so we have identified a set of factors that predict both later anxiety and change in anxiety. They're not exactly the same, so there are some differences between what predicts later anxiety and changes in anxiety, suggesting it is important to kind of look at both of those. But there are also these three common factors in terms of attachment security, maternal anxiety, and negative life events predicting both later anxiety and increases across childhood. Now, as I was talking, you've probably noticed I've been talking about mothers, and you might want to know something about whether fathers are important here as well. So I can just tell you that if you redo all the analyses that I just described from the NICHD's data set, they have, on a smaller number of families, they do have data on paternal attachment and paternal sensitivity. And if you look at the data for fathers, using their data instead of mother data, you see the same kinds of findings for paternal attachment as you do maternal attachment. Paternal sensitivity doesn't predict. And I notice, yeah. Okay, all right, so let me move to talking about how we can kind of pull all this together a little bit and spend just a little bit of time briefly talking about a model that, again, that we propose to try to help us think through what might be the pathways to anxiety and how can we consider these different risk factors together. One of the things that I think that isn't really built in the model I'm going to show you, but that I think we need to be thinking about is this whole distinction between understanding change versus understanding later levels of anxiety. And we may need to look at somewhat different sets of variables. So, for example, Nathan Fox was talking yesterday about whether behavioral inhibition might explain some of the stability in anxiety. And we might be looking more at these biological variables to explain stability and some of these social ecology variables like being exposed to negative life events, quality of relationships with parents and so on, as particularly important in terms of explaining change in anxiety symptomatologies. Another sort of general question that these findings raise is, in one study we were looking specifically at social anxiety. In the other study we were looking at sort of more general anxiety symptomatology. We can really ask, are parent-child relationships, are they a general risk factor for anxiety? Or are we going to find more specific linkages that particular aspects of parent-child relationships might prove to be risk factors for particular types of anxiety? And our data sort of suggests that parent-child relationships are more general risk factor. They're not specific risk factors for particular types of anxieties.